There is a particular kind of tiredness that has nothing to do with work. It settles over people who are trying to be responsible with their money. They read the articles, they watch the interviews, they hear one respected voice say a recession is coming, and another equally respected voice say the worst is behind us. They try to understand what inflation really means for their savings, what interest rates are doing to their future, whether they should be worried about debt they did not create and cannot control. And after all of that effort, they are left with the strange sensation of having learned a great deal and understood almost nothing. If you have felt that, you are not slow, and you are not slow, and you are not failing. You are reacting correctly to something real. The world of money has become genuinely, structurally more complicated over the last several decades, and that complexity is not neutral. It does not affect everyone the same way, and the people it quietly disadvantages the most are the ones with the least room to absorb a mistake, the small investor, the ordinary saver, the person who is not trying to get rich quickly, but simply trying not to lose ground. Ray Dalio, who has spent his career studying the largest machinery of the global economy, has often circled back to a surprisingly humble idea. The more he learned about how debt cycles work, how currencies rise and fall, how empires borrow and eventually pay for it, the more he emphasized principles simple enough to hold in your head, not because the world is simple, precisely because it is not. And that tension is where this whole story lives, because the honest question for an ordinary person today is not, how do I master the system? It is, how do I survive a system I will never master? Start with the thing almost no one says out loud. The financial world was not always this complicated, and it did not become complicated by accident. Every layer of complexity was added by someone who benefited from it. New products, new instruments, new strategies, new ways of packaging risk and moving it around. Each one was sold as sophistication, as progress, as a better tool, and in isolation, many of them were, but stacked on top of each other. Year after year, they created an environment where understanding the full picture became a full-time job requiring resources that no individual possesses. Think about what it actually takes to understand the modern economy well enough to act with confidence. You would need to follow central bank policy across multiple countries. You would need to understand bond markets, currency movements, credit conditions, corporate earnings, geopolitical risks, supply chains, and the psychology of millions of other participants who are all reacting to the same information at once. Large institutions do this with entire teams, with technology that reacts in fractions of a second, with information advantages built over decades. You're doing it in the evening after work, on your phone, hoping you have understood enough to not make a costly error. This is the first uncomfortable truth. The game is not rigged in the cartoon sense of a hidden hand deciding your fate. It is something subtler and harder to fight. The game is simply built at a scale that assumes you are not an individual at all. And when an individual tries to play it as if they can keep up, they do not fail because they are foolish. They fail because they accepted the wrong terms. Here is where most explanations stop, with a vague warning that the little guy is at a disadvantage. But that is not the real story, and it is worth pushing further, because the disadvantage is not where you think it is. The small investor's problem is rarely a lack of information. In fact, we are drowning in financial information as never before in history. The problem is that complexity does something specific to human decision-making. It does not just confuse us. It exhausts us into passivity, or it panics us into overreaction. And both of those are far more dangerous than simply not knowing. Consider what actually happens to a person surrounded by too much conflicting financial input. They do not calmly weigh it. They cannot. There is too much of it, and much of it contradicts itself. So they do one of two things. Some freeze. They stop making decisions at all, leaving money sitting in ways that quietly lose value, avoiding the discomfort of choosing by choosing nothing. Others swing to the opposite extreme. They become reactive, moving their money in response to the latest alarming headline, buying when a story makes them excited, selling when a story makes them afraid, always a step behind the very events they are chasing. Neither of these people is stupid. They are both responding rationally to an impossible amount of stimulus, and this is the mechanism that quietly harms ordinary savers more than any single market crash ever does. It is not one catastrophic event that erodes their position. It is a slow accumulation of anxious, reactive, contradictory decisions made under the pressure of complexity. They were never equipped to process. The damage is not dramatic. It is cumulative, and that makes it almost invisible while it is happening. And sit with why this matters at the level of an actual life, because this is not an abstract market discussion. This is about the difference between someone reaching their later years with stability and someone reaching them with fear. When a person spends 30 years reacting instead of planning, the cost does not show up as a headline. It shows up as a retirement that arrives less secure than it should have been. It shows up as savings that grew more slowly than they could have, not because the person lacked discipline, but because the sheer complexity of the environment kept pulling them off course. And the cruelty of it is that the effort makes it worse. The person who cares the most, who reads the most, who worries the most, is often the one most vulnerable to being whipsawed by every new piece of information. Caring deeply about your financial future in an environment engineered for complexity can become a liability rather than a strength. That is a genuinely unsettling idea, and it deserves to be sat with rather than rushed past. The instinct to engage more, to learn more, to react more, is exactly the instinct the environment punishes. So, we arrive at the paradox at the center of everything. If complexity is the threat, then the solution cannot be more complexity. It cannot be a smarter strategy, a better forecast, a more sophisticated instrument. Every one of those things pulls you deeper into the very game you cannot win. The solution has to move in the opposite direction. It has to be a deliberate, disciplined, almost stubborn commitment to simplicity. Not because simplicity is easy, because in this environment, simplicity is the hardest and most valuable thing an ordinary person can hold on to. But here we have to be careful, because the word simple has been abused. There is an entire industry of people offering fake simplicity, the one trick, the single asset that will save you, the confident prediction that removes all doubt. That is not simplicity. That is complexity in disguise, wearing a costume of confidence, and it is arguably more dangerous than the confusion it claims to cure. Real simplicity is not a shortcut. It is not a promise that you have found the secret. It is something much less exciting and far more durable. Dalio's own thinking points toward this repeatedly. When someone who has studied the machinery of global finance more closely than almost anyone alive keeps returning to a small number of durable principles, that is worth noticing. The takeaway is not that the world is simple enough to summarize. It is that a person functioning inside a complex world needs a framework simple enough to actually follow when they are frightened, tired, or uncertain. The value of a simple plan is not that it is smarter than the complexity around it. The value is that you will still be able to use it on the worst day, when a sophisticated plan would have collapsed under its own weight. This is the part that separates real survival thinking from financial entertainment. A plan that only works when you are calm, informed, and rational is not a plan. It is a fantasy about a version of yourself who does not exist under pressure. The real test of any financial approach is whether you can hold to it precisely when everything in the environment is screaming at you to abandon it. And the more complicated your approach, the more decision points it contains, the more places it can break exactly when you need it most. Look at how this plays out through history, because the pattern is older than any of us. In periods of financial stress, whether decades ago or in living memory, the people who came through with their stability intact were rarely the ones making the cleverest moves. They were more often the ones who had decided in advance what they would do and then simply did it, refusing to be pulled into the frenzy around them. The frenzy always feels like intelligence in the moment. Everyone reacting seems to be doing something smart and necessary. And in hindsight, most of that motion turns out to have been noise that cost the participants dearly. There is a reason this repeats. Human psychology does not update between crises. The tools change, the instruments change, the specific triggers change, but the underlying pattern of people being overwhelmed into bad decisions stays remarkably constant, which means the defense also stays constant. It has never been about predicting the next event. It has always been about building something durable enough that you do not have to predict it in order to survive it. And this reframes the entire question of what a small investor should even be trying to do. The goal was never to outsmart the institutions. That was always a losing frame. The goal is to become resilient enough that their game does not determine your fate. Those are two completely different objectives. One requires you to win a competition you are structurally unequipped to win. The other requires you to opt out of that competition entirely and build on ground the competition cannot easily shake. The first is exhausting and usually futile. The second is difficult in a different way because it requires the discipline to do less, not more. Doing less is genuinely hard. It runs against every instinct the environment cultivates. When headlines are frightening, doing nothing feels irresponsible. When everyone around you is moving their money, staying still feels like negligence. The financial media ecosystem survives on your engagement, and engagement means reaction, and reaction means motion. A person committed to a simple, durable plan is, in a sense, refusing to feed that machine, and that refusal will often feel wrong, even when it is right. That emotional difficulty is the real price of simplicity, and it is why so few people actually manage it. There is something almost quietly radical in choosing to understand a few things deeply rather than many things shallowly, to decide that you will grasp the basic forces at work, the way debt cycles create booms and busts, the way currencies lose value gradually and then suddenly, the way emotions drive markets more than logic, and then to build a plan robust enough to withstand those forces without requiring you to time them perfectly. That is not ignorance. That is a mature acceptance of your own limits, which is the beginning of real financial wisdom, because that is what this ultimately comes down to. The complexity of the modern financial world is, in part, a test of whether you know your own limits. The institutions know theirs, which is why they hire armies of specialists for every narrow function. The individual who pretends they can personally cover all of those functions is the one who gets hurt. The individual who accepts that they cannot and builds accordingly is the one who endures. Humility, in this context, is not weakness. It is the single most protective trait an ordinary investor can develop. And notice what this protects against, because it is more than money. It protects your attention, which is finite. It protects your peace, which the reactive approach steadily destroys. It protects your ability to make good decisions in the rest of your life. Decisions that get crowded out when your mind is constantly occupied by financial anxiety. The cost of trying to track everything is not only the poor financial outcomes. It is the quieter cost of a mind that never gets to rest, a person who carries the weight of an entire global economy they were never meant to hold alone. This is why a simpler survival plan is not a lesser plan for people who cannot handle the real thing. It is arguably the more sophisticated response because it correctly identifies the actual enemy. The enemy was never a lack of information. It was the impossibility of processing it all and the toll that impossibility takes on human beings who keep trying anyway. Seeing that clearly is itself a kind of freedom. It permits you to stop trying to win a game you were never going to win and to start playing a different game entirely, one where survival and stability, not cleverness, are the measure of success. None of this means the risks are imaginary. The debt levels are real. The uncertainty is real. The possibility of hard economic periods ahead is real, and no honest person can tell you exactly when or how they will arrive. Anyone who offers you that precision is selling you the very false certainty this whole story warns against. The point is not that there is nothing to fear. The point is that fear processed through complexity produces paralysis or panic, while the same fear processed through a simple, durable framework produces preparation. Same fear, completely different outcome. The difference is entirely in the structure you bring to it. So the deepest insight, the one worth carrying out of all this, is not a prediction and not a strategy. It is a shift in what you believe the challenge actually is. Most small investors think their problem is that they do not know enough. Their real problem is that they are trying to operate in a mode that only works for entities far larger than themselves. The moment you stop trying to keep up with the institutions and start trying to become resilient to whatever they in the wider world do, everything changes. The anxiety loosens, not because the danger disappeared, but because you finally stop fighting it on terms that guaranteed your exhaustion. The economy will keep growing more complex. That trend is not reversing in our lifetimes, and each new layer will again be sold as sophistication, again be genuinely useful in isolation, and again quietly raise the cost of trying to understand it all. The individuals who thrive will not be the ones who tracked every layer. They will be the ones who understood, early and deeply, that their edge was never going to come from complexity. It was going to come from the discipline to remain simple in a world that rewards you, emotionally and constantly, for doing the opposite. That is the survival plan. Not a secret, not a prediction, a refusal. a refusal to be pulled into a game built for someone else, and a commitment to build something small enough to hold, durable enough to last, and simple enough that you will still believe in it on the day when everything around you is on fire. The people who mastered the machinery of money learned this the long way. The ones who are only trying to protect what they have can learn it sooner. And in an economy that grows more complicated every single year, that quiet, unglamorous decision to keep your own plan simple may turn out to be the most sophisticated thing an ordinary person ever does.